Say hi to all the students who are watching this in ninth period or at home. Everybody say hi. Well, that was enthusiastic.
Hi. I love you.
All right, let's keep on going with exploring Africa. So, inventions like the astrolabe. Again, inventions like the astrolabe, which was from the Greeks, then the Muslims had it, then eventually, because it was Portugal and Spain, when the Muslims took them over, Portugal and Spain get a lot of good inventions come from the Muslim world in places like Cordoba and Toledo. Because of that, the Portuguese are the ones who really lead these expeditions. The Portuguese really begin an age of exploration for the Europeans. Now, Portugal. Why is Portugal the one that really kind of like gets this going? Well, Portugal in the 13th century, so in the 13th century, again the 1200s, Portugal was a pretty poor land and didn't have many resources. So they were kind of like on the edge. They had this technology that came in from the Muslims ruled them, but at this time they didn't have a whole lot of resources, and it was a fairly poor land to live in. So Portuguese sailors began pushing out into the Atlantic, and they found islands that would support Europe's demand for sugar production. So eventually they start going out, they start finding islands that would help them with sugar production. We can see here, if we look on this map right here, we see Portugal is right here. There's Porto's got a decent soccer team. Lisbon right here. They go out to these islands and everything, and they start going out, branching out, slowly going from island to island. By the 15th century, Portuguese were working with Italian entrepreneurs, and they were establishing sugar plantations. So they were establishing sugar plantations to grow sugar. Now, eventually they go from these islands here, Azores, we see this one here, they get down to Cape Verde, and they get into Senegal in 1460 again, we said. So there's all these islands they reach, and they start establishing sugar plantations on these islands. Now, they start exploring West Africa, and they explore the West African coast from 1415 until the 1600s. And the maps that we have from this time period are incredibly accurate, which means they were going back and forth quite a bit. They were using their technologies like the astrolabes to make charts and maps and learning from each other. But the amazing thing is that when they get to Africa, they don't go to Africa to conquer. The Portuguese really don't go to Africa to conquer. This will come later when lands get taken over. But one of the reasons why the Portuguese don't go to Africa to conquer is because when they get to Africa in the 1400s and 1500s at first, they find an equal trading partner. An equal trading partner. Number one, they can't take over Africa. They're not strong enough. The Africans are very different than what will happen when the Portuguese and Spanish get to America, where the natives start dying. The Africans don't die from the diseases. In fact, it's the reverse. The Europeans will get malaria, will get diseases. So the Europeans, it's not the same thing that happens in Latin America. So, the Africans, they traded gold, ivory, pepper with the Portuguese. But however, from 1450 to 1600, we also see 175,000 slaves are traded. So 175,000 slaves. Now that sounds like a big number. But if we look at that over 185 years, is this a really big number? Not comparatively to the slave trade later. The slave trade is not the first thing that happens when the Portuguese reach Africa. Go ahead.
It was an expansion of 150 years?
Say it again?
150 years, 175,000 slaves were traded?
Yep.
Okay.
Now in 1600, the year 1600 is when we see the slave trade starts growing and growing. The slave trade will grow after Spain and Portugal go to the Americas, after the natives start dying as the Americas become slaves, and then they go back and they try to get African slaves to replace the native slaves. Go ahead.
What were the Portuguese trading Africans?
Say it again.
What were the Portuguese trading Africans?
I'm going to have to look that up. Let me look and see if it's on my lecture here. If it's not, I will look it up. I'll get back to you. Okay? Also could be a 4.0 option. Yes?
Where do we have the slave trade grows after what?
1600 is when the slave trade really starts picking up. And for a reference point, when Alado Equiano was captured into slavery, 1762. So, but we do see there the slave trade is millions and millions. We see 9.5 million in 1500, 1870. 1600 is the year where it starts really like increasing though. All right, let's keep on going. So, now, so they arrive on the shores of Sierra Leone in 1460. And what happens is, by trading with Africa and keep on moving, Portugal starts to rise. And Portugal starts becoming the world power because this trade with Africa, this later trade with Asia, will strengthen them. Now, when they get to the cities in Africa, what they find is that the cities in Africa are equal to, some even greater than the cities that exist in Europe at this time. The accounts that the Portuguese write of the West African cities are very impressive. They encounter urban centers in West Africa comparable to Europe, governed by elaborate dynasties. We know that during this time period, when they get there, that we are in between the Songhai dynasty and the Mali Empire, right around that time period. They have agricultural systems that are very advanced in Africa that the Portuguese find. And they think they're definitely more organized. Many of the cities are more organized and more hygienic than back in Europe. And also a lot of the beliefs about magic, treatments of illnesses by people, kind of like using magic, were used both by Portugal and the West Africans. And they even traded kind of like beliefs on that and exchanged them. So, both the Portuguese and the Africans, both groups, the Europeans and the Africans, for example, believed in witchcraft during this time period. They were trading back and forth. Okay, any questions about this? Let's do this right now. All right, Portuguese explorers in Asia. So let's take a look here. And what we're looking at is the green on this is where Portugal went. We're looking at around, the 1400s to the 1600s. And it's pretty impressive, isn't it? And the thing amazing about Portugal is Portugal did conquer some land. They did take over some land. Nowhere near as much as Spain, France, and England will. Portugal is generally more interested in trade than conquering. Generally. Now, Brazil is an obvious exception to that. They take over Brazil. Yes?
Why only Brazil?
Why only Brazil? It's because all the land, what happened was there was a fight, I'll make this real quick. There was a fight between Spain and Portugal over land in basically South America. And the Pope came in and said, okay, we're going to draw a line right here. And Brazil is Portugal's territory in South America, which is pretty big. And Spain gets pretty much the rest, except for a few little lands up here like French Guiana. All right, so let's continue now. Portuguese explorers in Asia. So now they were exploring the whole west coast of Africa, kind of slowly going down, down, down further. And then eventually what happens is they get around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, Vasco De Gama is the first sailor not just to go around the Good Hope, but then get all the way into Asia. So Vasco da Gama, as we saw, gets all the way into Africa, all the way to Asia, to India. So we see that the Portuguese are the Europeans, and they finally make it. This big trip they've been wanting to do for a long time. To get around the Muslim traders here, they're able to travel around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way through Africa, making a whole lot of stops by African cities and African kingdoms on the east coast of Africa, which they didn't know about, all the way to India. Now, this opens up the door to maritime trade between Europe and Asian people and establishes permanent links between Europe and Asia. Before that, any links between Europe and Asia had to go through any trade through the Middle East. Now, this will affect the Middle East, too, in the Muslim world. Because now, are they in the prime location anymore? Suddenly, a lot of trade you can go around. And what we'll see is we'll start seeing a fall of the Muslim world being like in the center of the world of strength. And this will really happen when the Europeans start trading with Asia, and especially once they get to the Americas. And this will lead to Europeans becoming much stronger during this time period. So trading posts. Portuguese builds trading posts all over Africa, all over Asia. They get into Indonesia as well. Portuguese trading posts were designed not to conquer territory, but to control trade routes. And they forced merchant vessels to stop and pay duties or taxes. So basically, Portugal would set up trading posts all over this area where the boats could come in, they could get supplies, they can keep traveling. And they had to pay taxes for that. So this strengthened the Portuguese government too, because they got tax money coming in from all these traders. By the mid-16th century, like the 1550s, Portuguese merchants had built more than 50 trading posts between West Africa and East Asia, all along the line. So it's kind of like they're bypassing the Silk Road. It's now coming, it's over here this way, by Africa and into Asia. Afonso de Albuquerque, kind of sounds like Albuquerque, Albuquerque. He led the effort in seizing Hormuz in 1508, which is right around here. Gao in 1510, which is in India. And Malacca, which is all the way in Indonesia, in 1511. So it's like they were able to establish trading posts. It's kind of like a port or like a city where you just have the city there, the boats could land there, you could get goods. That was a trading post. It wasn't like going into the territory and conquering it. So you're like just on the edge of the sea, what these trading posts are. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Go ahead.
So you said it was when the ships or what did you say went
The
there?
ships would basically, they would have a place to like park the ship in a port, get supplies, and the Portuguese would trade with the local people there. And the local people, this was kind of like it was good business for both, because the local people were able to get all these goods that they didn't have from Portugal. And again, if you want to look up the goods the Portuguese were trading, look them up for 4.0 option. Go ahead quickly.
How many trading posts did you were able to establish?
50 trading posts between West Africa and East Asia. 50 trading posts between West Africa and East Asia. So all these dots we're looking at here are basically the Portuguese trading posts. All right, so from these sites, Albuquerque tried to control trade through the Indian Ocean. So the Portuguese tried to control all this trade. But they were only partially successful because of the number of ships they had. And eventually what happens is the English, the Dutch come in, they build stronger navies, and they come in and take over the land that's there. They're able to come in and take over the land. So to wrap it up, pretty much what happens is the Portuguese kind of like start out, they want to trade, they want to get rich, but eventually they're surpassed by other European nations. The English right here, the Dutch who are here, they come in, they build ships as well. They use a lot of the technology that the Portuguese start, and they come in and they conquer a lot of these Asia trading routes. And eventually England takes over India. We'll learn about that in our next unit. And the Dutch take over Indonesia, for example. So we'll see other European powers, the Dutch and English, come in and take over these lands that the Portuguese set up. I'm going to stop it.